You're watching Dialogue on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei from Beijing. China's family planning policy is a long-established policy aimed at reining in the population growth, which had made China one of the most populous nations in the world. But recently, there have been an increasing number of debates over whether the policy should be readjusted. Meanwhile, in the year 2012, an election year, women's reproductive rights became a central issue for political debates elsewhere in the world. So how will China's family planning policy develop in a new international and domestic environment? Joining us to answer these questions, I'm here joined by Professor Du Yang, who is with the Institute of Population and Labor Economics with China's Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome, Professor. Also joining us here in the studio, we have Professor Qiao Xiaochuan, who is with the Institute of Population Research at Peking University. Welcome as well, Professor.
Thank you.
But before we go to a discussion, professors, with the two of you, let's take a look at this background report.
The world's second largest economy and most populous country, China, is facing the most crucial demographic challenges in decades. The increasing gender imbalance, growing aging population, and loss of labor dividend. Critics from home and abroad are suddenly pointing their fingers at China's family planning policy. The family planning policy was introduced in the late 1970s to rein in China's surging population by limiting most urban couples to one child and most rural couples to two. The decreased growth rate of population helped promote the building of a sustainable economy and society, but the side effects of a shrinking labor force and the growing burden of elderly care are also looming. Between 2000 and 2010, China's population grew by 74 million people to 1.34 billion. The number of young as a proportion of the population aged under 14 contracted by 6.4%, while those over 65 grew by 1.91%. Analysts say demographic change takes decades to develop, and it might be high time for the new leadership to reconsider the country's population control policy to dodge the looming demographic crisis which may endanger the country's economy and social stability.
Professor Qiao, Professor Du, welcome to Dialogue. Well, China will stick to its family planning policy as a major set of policy for the country. That is an announcement being made by the Commissioner of the National Population and Family Planning Commission, Wang Sha, late 2012. What exactly do you think is the meaning of this statement, Professor Qiao, and the timing of it?
I think that, because China has already conducted family planning policy for over 30 years, then I think that even the government have already mentioned that the policy should be continued. But I think that in the future, such kind of policies have to be changed.
Has to be changed.
Yeah.
Well, it seems that you have the different opinions. But Professor Du, what do you think is the meaning and the background of this statement? Why the commissioner made such a statement then, and what do you think of the potential of this policy?
I think one of the background is we have already seen dramatic changes in the labor market, in China's labor market. For China, such a populous country, we are facing with labor shortage. So people think about that. We have already had the population control policy for a long time, and then we have a very low fertility rate. So that partly explains the labor shortage right now. So people are thinking about maybe it's time to change the policy, partly because of that, I think.
Should we mainly think about issues only from the labor perspective, from the economic perspective, or rather there is another aspect of the economic perspective which is also important, that is there is very limited per capita resources for everyone of this country because of huge population. And also there is going to be some social problems if the population is going to increase, if the policy is being lifted all of a sudden.
I think there are a lot of arguments here within your explanation. First of all, I think the resources per capita is not a determinant, should not be a determinant of population policy, right?
What should be then?
I think if we look at the other countries, we can find a lot of countries with very limited policies, very limited resources in terms of the per capita of natural resources, but they don't have such a population policy.
Which
like
country
us,
are you referring to?
Like Japan, South Korea, and actually they have a very, very good economic performance in the past 3 or 4 decades.
Interesting. But one might argue, Professor Chow, that both South Korea and Japan, they're at quite a different development stage compared to China, which is a developing country. And their population base to begin with was relatively much smaller than China's.
Right. Because some of the situation in Japan and South Korea may be quite same as in China, because China is have a very huge population, because China is the largest population public country in the world. But some of the issues that compared with them in China is similar, such as because they also have a family planning program, but as the fertility very lower, then they have changed the policy already. Not only due to the labor force shortage, but also due to they have some other problems, such as sex ratio at birth, increase very high, especially for the South Korea. And also they have very serious aging problems.
Right.
Yes, this kind of problems are very similar as in China.
Well, until this point, it is very important for us, I guess, to our audience, explain a little bit what exactly is China's family planning policy. Some take it as simple as one child, one family, but in reality, the policy is much more complicated than what is commonly believed. Professor Chow, you're an expert in this family planning policy issue. What exactly is it?
Yes, in Western country, people always think that China only has one-child policy, but actually not. One-child policy was conducted in 1980. After 4 years, then they changed the policy. And since then, it means that since 1984, China have already conducted different kind of family planning policy.
Which is?
That is, mostly in rural areas. Once a couple have a son for the first child, then they can allow to have a second one. This is very general policy. It means that most of the provinces in rural areas, they conduct this kind of policy. Then also, there is some of the areas do
so
keep the
it means
one-child
that
policy.
if they have a daughter, for example,
right,
they can still have the second child as
yes,
an option.
Right.
Because the rural areas needs this hard labor in a way.
Right. Then also because the situation of that areas. So this is very general, the policy. Then also something special. For example, there's still some provinces they still keep one-child policy. They also have some provinces they have two-child policies. So it's quite different. And also for some minority areas, even they have a three-child policy.
So it is very diverse in a way, rather than just simplified one child, one family.
Right.
So if that is the picture that we are talking about, Professor Du, should we rush to readjustment of this policy without specifically looking at the policy, the result of that readjustment, if there is going to be any?
Actually, I just want to continue the topic we just discussed, and I do agree we should have some adjustment in the population control policies, but it's not from
it's not population control policies, rather family planning policies, sir.
Okay, it's family planning policies, but I don't think it should be from the purpose of Actually, I do agree. Your opinion is not from the economic perspective, because first of all, even we adjust the population policy right now, maybe we cannot see very significant effect to stimulate the fertility rate to grow. And according to the other international experience, once the fertility rate goes down, it's very hard to revert the trend. Second of all, even if we have a higher fertility rate right now, the effect on the market will be 20 years later. So it's not from the economic perspective. We should concern that population policy adjustment from other social and maybe population policies per se.
Interesting. That debate is not only going on here in China, but also in other economies. For example, emerging economies such as the country India. And we are joined live by Professor M.D. Nalapad from Manipal University in India. Professor Nalapad, welcome to our program.
Yes, thank you very much.
We understand, Professor Nalapad, that India, after quite a few years of debate, has eventually decided, according to different localities, to practice sterilization policy in different areas. And we understand that is in a way to lower the fertility rate inside your country. You have a goal there. Is it achievable?
Well, the reality is that India did have a sterilization policy between 1975 and 1977. And that created a lot of anger among the Indian people, so much so that the party in power, the Congress party, was completely defeated in the 1977 election in all the states where this kind of mass sterilization took place. So after that, governments in India are very, very careful to not to ask for compulsory sterilization, but to make available facilities for family planning and for including sterilization, abortion, etc., to make available these facilities throughout the country and leave it to the judgment of the people as to whether they want to take advantage of it or not. The bad political experience of 1975-77 has meant that after that, family planning has not been a very popular issue in India.
On the other hand, Professor Nalapad, we understand that India is a country rich with its religious cultures, as well as various different cultural traditions. Some are historical, some might not necessarily so. And therefore, how do you think those factors are influencing what we call the right choices that India can make when it comes to family planning policy or practices?
Well, you raised a very, very important question. And here we are seeing in India that states that are more economically productive, that states where there is more economic and social development, states where there is higher educational development, especially among the female population, when the females are better educated, they have more income, we find that population levels are coming down and the rate of population increase is coming down. In about 45% of India, the rate of population increase is actually very manageable. But it is true that in the most backward parts of India, the most uneducated and economically backward parts of India, population rates are still very high. So this is an important problem that we are facing in India, that we have to increase the rate of economic growth, we have to increase the rate of education so that the people themselves understand that a smaller family is a better family.
Both China and India are emerging economies. Both countries are some of the world's biggest country when it comes to population. Therefore, do you think, Professor Nalapad, there are lessons and experiences that the two can learn from one another's history?
Well, I definitely think so. And so far as China is concerned, I've been visiting China regularly for about 15 years. And in these 15 years, I have seen a remarkable change in the Chinese people. So from a sociological point of view, in my view, the Chinese people are now more and more ready to go to the right choices regarding the number of children to have. And I think they can be given greater responsibility in this. China is not a static society. It's a very dynamic society. It has changed a lot in 15 years. And therefore, I agree with the Chinese professor who said that there can be a relaxation of the population policy in China and we can leave it to the good sense of the Chinese people to come to the family size that is best for them. I do believe the Chinese people have reached an educational, social level such that they are quite capable of taking these own decisions for themselves.
MD Nalapat, thank you very much from Manipur University in India. Thank you so much, Professor. Now let's come back to our studio discussion. Earlier we have an Indian professor who mainly, I would believe, visited Chinese cities, particularly metropolitan areas, to finally have his judgment about whether Chinese are ready to be able to make further decisions. However, we know that China's situation is much more complicated than just a few metropolitan areas. Professor Chow, and therefore, China is already having this very diverse levels and tiers when it comes to family planning policy. But should there be more of them, given the very diverse country that we have? When you say it has to be readjusted, what exactly do you mean? Do you mean to lift the limits of children that one family can have immediately and once, all at one time, for everyone, every family? Or do you mean that there can be a gradual process? And where can the gradual process, if that is what you meant, begin, and from where?
Yeah, I think that it's really important if we choose to readjustment of the family planning policy. You know, China really diverse. It's almost impossible to change the family planning policy over one night. You know, under even the whole country suddenly. But I think that because in China, in the eastern area, the people in eastern areas are quite different, as people in the western area, especially for the desire of number of children. So I think that if we try to change the policy, we have to, go step by step. This means that we have to be, conducting some of the new policy, just a little bit of changing as before. I think this is one of the things we have to
minor adjustments.
Yes, minor, yes. Then
or pilot projects.
Yes, another part of things that we have to have the pilot, experiment. This means that we have to start it in somewhere where their, birth there is quite lower. Yeah.
Professor Zhu?
I think you raised a very good point about the timing of policy adjustment. Actually, I did some research before on the determinants of the fertility declining in China, and I found in 1980s and early 1990s, the population policy actually dominated the declining. I mean, to explain what the fertility decline. But since then, the economic development played a very active role to decrease the fertility rate. That means right now, even we relaxed the population policy because of the economic development, because of people are getting richer and richer. So it's still, possible to, it's still impossible to revert the decline, the fertility rate. And actually, the Indian colleague raised a very good point. China, invested a lot in education, including the women, and that also played very, very important role in fertility determination. So I think it's we don't have to worry about so much about the
well, I'm not sure if we are necessarily guaranteed with some very, how can I say, sensible decisions about fertility. As long as the economy is doing well, as long as people's income are increasing, because you might see very different examples emerging also from the relatively richer areas here in China, in which businessmen or women, when having acquired a lot of wealth, still would like to follow the old tradition of having many children, as many as possible. There are also examples like that. So I would really like to explore further about this topic with the two of you professors right after this break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Dialogue, and welcome back as well. With me in the studio, we have Professor Qiao Xiaochun from the Institute of Population Research with Peking University, and Professor Du Yang from the Institute of Population and Labor Economics, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Earlier, gentlemen, both of you have illustrated from your own perspective, population policy perspective, economic perspective, as to whether China should follow its original family planning policy, which is now still in practice. You raised an interesting point, Professor, earlier, whether the growth of personal wealth, whether the growth of the national economy or regional economy necessarily guarantee a solemn decision for fertility rate growth in the region or for one single family. Some have argued differently, that even though people are getting richer, people are getting more educated, people are still inclined to follow the old traditions of having as many children as possible. Those are still existing.
Yeah. Yes. I think that, in China you cannot say something very, very general. You cannot say that all Chinese people just like to have a less number of children. But China really diverse. But for example, for the richer people, I think that some of people try to have more number of children, than even for the poor people they also have. But if we think someone in China try to have a less number of children, that should be in the middle. This means that in the middle level of people may try to have less number of children because they have less desire, just only for the number of children, but because they have desire to have have a high income and other expectations.
Right.
So that's really different.
So at this moment, it seems that both of you agree that the policies can be readjusted, but there needs to be minor readjustment, a gradual process. And meanwhile, things should be started right now for whether it's minor experiments or pilot projects. But let me ask you, with these as background, how can we balance, on the one hand, think about the long-term future, think about possibility of readjustment. On the other hand, you have the existing laws and regulations for family planning. For example, in certain areas, just one child for one family. And how to implement these laws. Should these laws be strictly implemented, or should one eye open, the other eye closed, as some say? Professor Qiao.
I think that even in national level, even the provincial level, they have a regulation for the family planning program. But I think that such kind of regulations also should be changed. Not only dealing with the policy of the number, but also dealing the measures, how to conduct family planning policy. So I think that, if we change some of the regulation, but you have to change the policy first, because different policy dealing with different measures.
But this is contradictory to what you have just said, because you said it has to be a gradual process.
Yeah.
It has to start from a pilot project, and therefore it has to be gradual, and the adjustment has to be minor to begin with. But on the other hand, you said, well, there has to be changes. But these changes will happen immediately or not?
This to be changed immediately, but it should be minor changing.
What do you mean by minor changes?
Minor changing means that we just go very little step first.
Okay,
then,
let me give you an example.
Right.
Shenzhen, for example, which is a special economic zone here in China, it is much relatively a richer area compared to the western part of this country. And it has once again reiterated its policy, family planning policy for that region, which is one child for one family. It specifically also outlined the fines, the financial fines a family would receive even if they're giving birth to another child, let's say whether in Hong Kong or in the United States, as some rich couples tend to do that just to escape the loopholes of the policies of one-child policy here in China. So do you think these practices should go on as it is already trying to implement what the existing laws? Or do you think this is not exactly the right policies?
But I think that such kind of policy may be dependent on their own situation. China really different. But Shenzhen is in China we call that a city. City only have very limited right to changing some of the policy. But in general, the provincial level should have the right to change the policy. But I think that for Shenzhen, I think that their policy is not just policy dealing with the formal regulation, but just only for some decision by the government level. I think that this is not quite good way to let all the people to have only one child in a family. So,
Interesting.
Yeah.
In China, there's always the issue of whether you are implementing the laws and regulations.
Yeah.
And now here the argument, it seems that what you are saying is, even though the law and regulations exist,
Yeah.
maybe you don't want to implement it. Because there's
Yeah.
something, it has to come in turn. Whether you change the laws and regulation first and then implement it, or you ignore the laws and regulation first and you try to do another practice. Of course, the latter is to not be encouraged in a society which is ruled by the rule of law.
Yeah,
So
sure.
let's go to Professor Du.
I do think that we are discussing policy. So it's if we have the policy right now, of course the society should let everybody to follow to obey the law. That's no problem, I think. But if the policy, or it's a time to change the policy from different perspectives. Why we discuss it, not discuss it now and start to do something? That's a very clear to me.
Well, there are so many stories related to.
Actually, you mentioned the very rich guy can have a lot of children. I think this is partly linked with.
They have the desire to have a lot of children.
Partly have something to do with the policy. When you have very strict policy to have children, then have more children it's like a luxury good. So if you can pay high price, you can get it. Then the price is getting higher, and then you can show off you are richer. So it's
well, I'm not sure whether to having more children is really a sign of you are getting much richer than the others, but rather it coincides. Yeah. If you can pay the fines, it coincides with the desire that some people have to have many children, as many as possible, which might be different from still the family planning policy being practiced in the region.
Right. So I think it's partly because of the policy.
Interesting. Well, we have very limited time today. This is a massive topic, not only for China, but also for the rest of the world. Debates are also going on about family planning in the United States, in India, and elsewhere in the world. Of course, the cultural and economic and political environments there are very different from here. But we're going to continue our discussion about this interesting issue, I'm sure, for the months to come. Thank you very much, professors, for being with us. Thank you for joining us. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing.
Imbalance, growing aging population, and loss of labor dividend. Critics from home and abroad are suddenly pointing their fingers at China's family planning policy. The family planning policy was introduced in the late 1970s to rein in China's surging population by limiting most urban couples to one child and most rural couples to two. The decreased growth rate of population helped promote the building of a sustainable economy and society, but the side effects of a shrinking labor force and the growing burden of elderly care are also looming. Between 2000 and 2010, China's population grew by 74 million people to 1.34 billion. The number of young as a proportion of the population aged under 14 contracted by 6.4%, while those over 65 grew by 1.91%. Analysts say demographic change takes decades to develop, and it might be high time for the new leadership to reconsider the country's population control policy to dodge the looming demographic crisis which may endanger the country's economy and social stability.
Professor Chow, Professor Du, welcome to Dialogue. Well, China will stick to its family planning policy as a major set of policy for the country. That is an announcement being made by the Commissioner of the National Population and Family Planning Commission, Wang Sha, late 2012. What exactly do you think is the meaning of this statement, Professor Chow, and the timing of it?
I think that, because China has already conducted family planning policy for over 30 years, then I think that even the government have already mentioned that the policy is to be continued. But I think that in the future, such kind of policies have to be changed.
Has to be changed.
Yeah.
Well, it seems that you have the different opinions. But Professor Du, what do you think is the meaning and the background of this statement? Why the Hello, and you're watching Dialogue on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei from Beijing. China's family planning policy is a long-established policy aimed at reining in the population growth, which had made China one of the most populous nations in the world. But recently, there have been an increasing number of debates over whether the policy should be readjusted. Meanwhile, in the year 2012, an election year, women's reproductive rights became a central issue for political debates elsewhere in the world. So, how will China's family planning policy develop in a new international and domestic environment? Joining us to answer these questions, I'm here joined by Professor Du Yang, who is with the Institute of Population and Labor Economics with Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome, Professor. Also joining us here in the studio, we have Professor Qiao Xiaochuan, who is with the Institute of Population Research at Peking University. Welcome as well, Professor.
Thank you.
But before we go to a discussion, professors, with the two of you, let's take a look at this background report.
The world's second largest economy and most populous country, China, is facing the most crucial demographic challenges in decades. The increasing gender